you've been shearing quite a few sheep and you've been sharpening a lot of times, the bevel on your shears will get quite thick. So you can see here that white line, that's a sharpening bevel, and it's gotten to just over 1 millimeter in width, which doesn't seem that thick, but as you sharpen more and more, you have to move more steel to get your shears sharp, and so it'll take more and more rubs of your stone to get the shears sharp. So to speed up sharpening, I generally grind my shears to make that sharpening bevel thinner after every 25 to 50 sheep, and that just means that each time I sharpen, it just takes a couple of quick swipes of the stone and I can go straight back to shearing. So when you're sharpening, you tend to sharpen a little bit more at the front because you use the shears more at the front. So generally that means you need to grind a little bit more at the front to get your stoning bevel even across the shears. To do that, I tend to use nice smooth sweeps across the stone. So I generally start by going with a short one so it just grinds the front, then a swipe that goes 2/3 of the way along the shears, and then I do one that goes right along, and maybe a second one to go right along. It depends how long in between grinds. You might want to repeat that process again if you've shorn maybe 100 or 200 sheep since your last grind. And the aim is to get that sharpening bevel down to maybe 1/4 of a millimeter, just so it's a very thin line. If you're shearing sheep that have a lot of debris, stones or sticks in the wool, you may want to leave that stoning bevel a little bit thicker, just because it means that you're less likely to damage your shears. When I'm grinding, I find it's best to use slow, steady, methodical swipes across the stone, so you get a nice even grind across your shears and you have good control of your shears. If you swipe too fast, you risk hitting the end of your shears on the grindstone and knocking the point off, and that takes a lot of work to get that back. If you swipe back and forward in the middle of your shears, you tend to grind more at each point where you stop, and so you'll end up with a point at the front of the sweep and the back of the sweep that are overground, and a point in the middle that's not ground enough, and that'll end up leaving you hollows in your shears, and that's where you'll have real troubles keeping your shears sharp. Pays to check your shears while you're grinding so that you don't overgrind any particular areas, and so you'll look along the edge, you'll see where it's still thick and you need to grind some more, but again you just want to use slow methodical sweeps to grind those areas. Even when you're grinding just a small patch that's still too thick, you still want to just use slow methodical sweeps and check the area regularly to make sure you're not over grinding. So these shears have a nice thin stoning bevel at the back. Up the front here it's still about 1/4 to 1/3 of a mil. That's about where I like to have it. It's a little thinner than I would normally like at the back here, unless I was shearing superfine merinos where I might be using a really fine oil stone where I want that edge as thin as possible so it didn't take too much sharpening. So now that I've ground these shears, the stoning bevel is nice and thin all the way along, maybe under 1/4 of a mil thick at the back of the shears and about 1/4 of a mil thick at the front. It would be nice to have them perfectly even, but that's not possible. Of course, we're all human. At this thickness, it should only take about sort of 1 or 2 swipes of the stone to get them sharp in between each sheep. Now that you've ground your shears, it's a good idea to give them a quick stone, so I'll give them a sharpen, I'll back them off, and then a really quick sharpen again, and then test them on some wool to make sure that edge is back up. If you've overground, so you've ground that stoning bevel right off, you'll need to stone a little bit more to make sure that edge is thick enough and isn't going to get damaged by any impurities in the wool or even some dense wool. You want to make sure that you've got at least 1/4 of a mil stoning bevel back onto your shears before you start shearing with them again. So now that you've ground your shears and you've put the edge back on them, you should be ready to get back into it.